Again, good morning, everyone. The title of our paper is Non-violencing, Reflections of Nonviolence Pedagogy with Lao Tzu and Deleuze in the Era of Pandemic. Our discussion today is based on an article that Seungho and I published recently, which is a cross-cultural conversation about the possibilities and potentials for nonviolence pedagogies.
When I look at Charlie's articulation of Deleuzean idea of haxiety literally means by thisness. So we had a really great conversation over the past years of, we are great colleagues and friends and talked about how to react as a scholar for this political event and all the institutionalized racism. And Charlie is an expert in Deleuzean idea, and I try to go back to my intellectual and cultural heritage from Eastern thought, particularly Taoism. So we had the kind of meeting point of this, the fluidity of haxiety is a reminiscent for me, at least Taoist philosophy of Wu Wei. Wu Wei is, namely non-action approach to leadership and social transformation with the emphasis on less time intervention, effortless action, selfless action, and ultimately returning to nature, natural law. So in explicating Wu Wei philosophy within Tao Te Ching, water is often used. So, Tao Te Ching is very difficult to essentialize, but in this paper, I try to pinpoint water image to articulate the meaning of fluidity and flowing of, violence and nonviolence, how to dismantle this duality and by using this water metaphor. So for example, in advocating the paradoxical power of water, Lao Tzu in his Tao Te Ching stage, there is nothing softer and weaker than water. And yet there is nothing better for attacking hard and strong things. Wu Wei, which is the action of non-action, as the most active action is powerful in its minimal intervention and non-prefixed interpretation of an event or possible resolution. Wisdom in this fluidity is effective in the face of sameness, authoritarian interventions to resolve conflict. The emphasis on the process and spontaneity of water in Taoism offers an imaginative space to coin the term nonviolence. And again, we try to theorize the meaning of nonviolence in pedagogy. And for me, this water image from Tao Te Ching gave me a really important message of, how to use the wisdom from Tao Te Ching for elements that I theorized, again, the minimal interventions. So best doctor is a surgeon who does the surgery best. It's not the best doctor in the Tao Te Ching. The best doctor is really does time intervention so that a patient does not go to the point of getting a surgery. So this is what Wu Wei philosophy talks about in a summary. So out of these 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, again, I go back to this water image to emphasize the fluidity of violence and nonviolence pedagogy. So basically, nonviolencing, we theorize as open-ended fluid movement. So in theorizing nonviolencing, we utilize relational and contextual characteristics of water. In Tao Te Ching, water is used to illustrate great Tao, and we connect the notion of nonviolencing with this water image. So water is characterized by where it is located and how it is channeled without any prefixed shape or direction. No shape, color, or flavor pre-exists before water is contained in a certain context. So in theorizing the meaning of nonviolence in pedagogy, we try to highlight the importance of social political context rather than predetermine, this is a violent act or this is a nonviolent act. So in the same way, nonviolencing adopts the fluidity and openness of water while resisting a fixed normalized approach to the binary of violence and nonviolence. So by using this water image to depict nonviolencing, we investigate the social political standpoint of those whose benefits are highlighted, whose stances are recognized, and whose perspectives are normalized within a given society. That's what I mean by when you say all lives matter, we have to really challenge whose voice is still excluded by saying we. And this is an example of how we can apply this nonviolence and pedagogy practices. So nonviolencing is becoming, that's why we try to shift from nonviolence education toward nonviolencing pedagogy is becoming the same way that water is spontaneous and unpredictable. This is a process-oriented understanding of nonviolence rather than outcome-oriented judgment of what violence or nonviolence is. Social, political, and cultural approaches to nonviolencing leaves a space for pondering such contextual knowledge by avoiding this duality of violence or nonviolence. So it's good to go back to our Tao teaching wisdom that water does not follow a conventional notion of being strong. So people usually think that you have to be strong to fight against something. But from this femininity perspective, water does not possess shape before meeting others' objects. Laozi highlights that supposedly weak components of no shape or no direction paradoxically enable water to become much stronger than other fixed objects such as rocks or metals. And this is a very insightful to think about within this current institutionalized racism. What kind of social actions we take, it's really important to protest. It's really important to just, fight against this white supremacy. But from this Taoist perspective, I'm just pondering what other discourses are possible to shift the discourse on nonviolence education. For example, politicians try to blame China for this pandemic by saying Wuhan virus or China virus, and how we can create this Wu-Wei philosophy and create a new language to just encourage people to think out of their bias or existing boxes. This is a great example to just encourage people to say COVID-19 is what WHO claims to indicate this virus, and how we can actually make that happen rather than keep blaming China for the origin of this virus. This is a great example of how we can use the wisdom of this nonviolence in pedagogy in practices. And I added this yin and yang cosmology to extend the notion of this nonviolence in pedagogy. And yin and yang pedagogy is constant movement and changes in yin and yang to construct the realities and practices of violence and nonviolence. There is no absolute division between, oh, this is a violent act or this is a nonviolent act. And given this very paradoxical and very blurred boundaries, and I highlight the movement of becoming illustrate the unpredictability of predictability, as well as predictability of unpredictability. So I want to see the paradox and challenges of this dichotomous thought, and yin and yang cosmology will give a new insight how to think out of our box and how to go beyond any dichotomous understandings about violence and nonviolence. So in some nonviolence which is in this paradoxical space of in-betweenness, again, to avoid this binary thinking. So the dividing lines between yin and yang seem certain, but they are not, they never are. So this is the core of Eastern thought. The line exists in motion. That's why there are dots within yin, and there is a yang dot within yang. Yin and yang relationship is symmetrical in representing different elements of the world. Yin does not exist without yang, vice versa. So how we can look at this violence and nonviolence from this yin and yang dynamics, and the line between violence and nonviolence, it's always in motion, and how we can examine, explore the boundaries that cannot be separated with the two distinct concepts.
So the discussion, Seungho's discussion about Wu-Wei and yin and yang cosmology was very provocative for me, because there are a lot of elements of it that seem to be connected to or resonant with the way that Deleuze discusses the world as always in the process of becoming, and that in the flow of events, some things emerge as individuations, some things emerge as distinct events, some things emerge as distinct concepts. And so it was you know, it began to feel like our cross-cultural conversation was really finding some interesting registers at which they in which they resonated together. And so I want to return to one which I mentioned previously, which is haexeity, which Deleuze uses as the emergent and distinct thisness of an object of an event or an event. It's how we might identify and say, okay, well, this is specific, this is a particular event, and this is how it came about. This is how it emerged from the flow of actions and activities. And so I think one way that Deleuze describes it, which is particularly helpful to understand it, is he describes haexeity as an hour, a day, a season, a climate, one or several years, a degree of heat and intensity, very different intensities which combined have perfect individuality, which should not be confused with that of a thing or a formed subject. And so to me, that notion about, you know, an hour or a day can be distinct and clear in and of itself, but also part of a larger flow of things, a longer flow of things, that it can emerge as this distinct object, but also as part of a larger flow and process of becoming. Now, within that, I also think about Deleuze and Guattari's notion of minoritarianism. And in this, in minoritarianism, Deleuze and Guattari really encourage us to stop thinking about transcendental and universal rules and to try to think and work on a small, intimate scale, to understand the spaces around us and to function in those spaces around us, to work on a minor scale, to work in the really small, close quarters when we try to take actions in the world. They write, everything in a minor philosophy is political. It's cramped spaces force each individual intrigue to connect immediately to politics. And so for Deleuze, while events emerge in the flow of time or the flow of actions, that haexeity as things emerge is distinct. We also are functioning within our immediate surroundings and in our immediate relationships. And so when we seek to take political actions, when we seek to make change, we should resist the desire to think in transcendental and universal terms and really focus on the world around us and the activities and actions we can take in the political spaces that we are a part of through our relationships and in our immediate situations. And in turn, we should be comfortable with the notion of an embrace multiplicity. That is, even things that are nominally unified and the same are each uniquely different. So Deleuze writes, multiplicity, which replaces the one no less than the multiple, is the true substantive substance itself. Even the many is a multiplicity. Even the one is a multiplicity. Instead of the enormous opposition between the one and the many, there is only the variety of multiplicities. In other words, difference. And so, again, when I think about the haexeity, the emergence of an event, or in this case, nonviolence, and then try to think of it in sort of minor terms, think about it as close and personal and embedded in the immediate situation and relationships in which we find ourselves, we should further be comfortable with the idea that there are multiple forms of nonviolence, that there are many different kinds and many different forms that nonviolence will take, that nonviolencing is intimately tied into the situation where it's found and doesn't have an overarching specific set of methods or definitions, that it really is embedded in the actions that we take and the actions that we understand as being the ones that will help preempt violence or address harm or try to abolish violent actions in the future. That we need to think on these minor scales and also be open to the multiplicity of nonviolence, the multiplicity of forms which nonviolence might take, and not necessarily debate the what the transcendental universal nonviolence principles are, but think in terms of our own situations and activities. An example of nonviolence pedagogy of non-violencing that Seungho and I identified that we really liked was the William Joyner Institute for the Study of War and Social Consequences at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So the Joyner Institute promotes research, curriculum development, events, and educational, cultural, and humanitarian exchanges which address the consequences of war. So they serve veterans, family members of veterans, war refugees, and all victims of war. They aim to create a public space where the issues of war and their human, social, political, and environmental consequences can be openly discussed, debated, and analyzed. So this was an example that we felt enacted non-violencing as we were conceptualizing it. So the activities of the Joyner Center, which we would encourage you to explore, capture some of the elements that we think of as non-violencing pedagogy. In that non-violencing pedagogy seeks to create a shared imagination, one that fosters the ability to envision aspects of non-violence that exceed a nominal description. In implementing a non-violence curriculum, educators are tempted to use prescriptive, universalized context, defining what it is and what it should be. Previously, Seungho had talked about non-violencing education as creating a list of terms or ideas which students would learn that this is non-violence, that this is non-violence, that this is non-violence. And instead, our non-violencing pedagogy wants to push past that and begin to have students think about how it is non-violence can emerge within the situations and the spaces in which they live and work.
So actually what Charlie described is from Tao Teaching's very first chapter, that if you name something, if you name Tao, it's not Tao anymore. So we got the idea of how to invite people with this open-endedness and reimagine nonviolence education with the use of imagination and provocative places. So we theorize nonviolence and pedagogy as an imaginary and provocative place to embrace the unknowable, the unknown, and unknowingness as a potential launching point for exploring new approaches to education that involve examining familiar notions in different ways and transforming our taken for grantedness into ongoing inquiries. This is when I present with Charlie about this idea, people are asking, so what, right? So give me the list of, nonviolence pedagogy. Actually, the reviewers of this journal ask the same questions. But guess what? We don't have definite answer, but we invite this open space to have, conversation and talk about how to really challenge this very Eurocentric perspectives, not only in the US, but also around the world. I grew up in Korea, and I can see how Korean society has been colonized by this very Eurocentric perspective to look at, Europe as a very advanced country and look at other countries as the other, and how to generate a conversation where the kind of colonialism, intellectual colonialism happened through learning world history. For example, in my high school and middle school year in Korea, I learned that, Columbus, discovered the new path to the U.S. or the, American continent, but it's not true. There were lots of, Chinese people came to the American continent historically, and there are lots of records that Columbus was not the first one who came to the American continent. And how to invite this kind of conversation to dismantle our taken for grantedness about the world history. And this is the very beginning of process of very critical eye to look at what we are educated through very Eurocentric curriculum. So we provide this idea of let's leave this open-ended space to inquire history, past, present, and the future.
So another writer on nonviolence, this one, the historian Chip Kosick, who wrote a fantastic book about Christian nonviolent war resistors to World War II. So that's a small scale American Christian movement, which actually advocated for the United States non-involvement in World War II, and for the United States to take a non-violent role in the Second World War. And crucially, this group included Bayard Rustin, who would go on to become sort of one of the core lieutenants for Martin Luther King and a key organizer in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. In any case, Kosak's exploration of the Christian nonviolent resistance to World War II raises this idea about the openness to uncertainty is crucial in learning about nonviolence. So uncertainty is related to visceral reactions about ethical issues that cannot be narrowed down with the use of right or wrong. There's always open space for non-dual perception, thoughts, and actions about certainty and uncertainty. The certainty of uncertainty or the uncertainty of certainty represent the paradox of the Taoist version of being and non-being. Context matter in decision-making. Relationships among gendered, racialized, and class subjects matter in considering the context of events.
In implementing a non-violence curriculum, actually educators are tempted to use prescriptive, universalized content and confining what it is and what should be. So again, this is what teachers ask, show us some lesson plan that we can teach on Monday morning next week. And we invite more imagination across curriculum that educators can ponder about. So Taoism teaches us that just naming Tao does not represent the being of Tao, as the chapter 1 of Tao teaching indicates. Neither does a generalized, stable version of a nonviolence curriculum illuminate the art of it. So we theorize nonviolence by reflecting on the paradox of Tao, which exists without naming. So this theorization is valuable if the notion of nonviolence becomes open-ended and flexible, depending on the specific socio-political context in which a violent act takes place. So I believe that nonviolence in curriculum should be different between the US and China, for example, because we live in a different context. And being open to this paradox, that is the impossibility of naming nonviolence in pedagogy, enables teachers to release their pedagogical imagination in teaching nonviolence. Another advantage of the Tao paradox in nonviolence in pedagogy is to include multiple teaching learning resources in addressing the how of nonviolence. That's what Charlie highlighted. We got stuck to describe what nonviolence is and what to teach it, but we invite you to think about how of nonviolence, and we expect that teachers can become open to new pedagogies in teaching nonviolence beyond any normalized, standardized approaches to teaching it.